Trump has been expressing interest in buying Greenland.
His dream of owning Greenland.
We need Greenland for national security purposes. If this deal's not done, all hell is going to break out.
Trump wants to buy Greenland. He said so in 2019 and now again in late 2024. But is this just some crazy idea that Donald had, or is there some meaning and reasoning behind? In this video, I will uncover the full story of why the US and Trump are so interested in buying Greenland. Greenland has been on the US's radar for over a century. In 1916, the US issued a declaration recognizing Denmark's sovereignty over Greenland, a Danish colony at that time. In exchange, Denmark sold the Danish West Indies, now the US Virgin Islands, to the US. This was important to Denmark in countering future claims on Greenland and leveling with the US on the Greenland question. Because in the Monroe Foreign Policy Doctrine of 1823, the US aimed to keep European powers out of the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine, articulated by the US President James Monroe, viewed any European intervention in the political affairs of the Americas as a hostile act against the United States. In other words, US, the former colony, didn't want to see the former colonial powers like the British, the French, the Spanish, or the Danes on the Western Hemisphere again. But Greenland is located in the Western Hemisphere, so it's essentially still a European colony in the Americas. So gaining the US's acceptance of the Danish presence in Greenland and so in the Western Hemisphere in 1916 was super important for Denmark. 25 years later, during World War II, Nazi Germany set up weather stations on the east coast of Greenland. The Nazi presence on Greenland was only limited to a few stations, and they were eventually found and eliminated by the Greenland Sledge Patrol and Allied forces. But it alarmed the US as this prospect of a full-scale German takeover of Greenland would maybe enable the Nazis to bomb American cities during the war. So in 1941, the US signed an agreement with Denmark that allowed the US to actively defend Greenland and establish bases on Greenland. However, this agreement was made and signed by the Danish ambassador Henrik Kaufmann and not the Danish government in the Nazi-occupied Denmark. Kaufmann convinced the US government that Denmark was not a free country at that time and that he could act on behalf of Denmark during the war. This made him a very controversial figure in Denmark. Was he a traitor to the Danish policy of Nazi collaboration with the aim of saving lives and preserving democratic institutions during the war? Or was he a hero and the true voice of the free Denmark? In my view, Kaufmann was instrumental in convincing the Allied forces that Denmark was not sided with the Nazis. Moreover, he probably also prevented an eventual and necessary US takeover of Greenland during the war, in which case Greenland's subsequent fate would have been up in the air. There is a clear parallel to the situation in Iceland, another Danish Atlantic colony. In 1944, the British occupied the island and the Icelandic people seized the moment to declare their independence and thus part ways with Denmark. But back to Greenland. After the Second World War in 1946, President Harry Truman offered Denmark $100 million in gold to purchase Greenland. The reason? Defense and security. Already in 1946, the year after the end of World War II, it was quite clear that an Iron Curtain had come down in Europe, essentially starting the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union. The offer was turned down by Denmark, but US military presence continued on the island, most notably on the Thule base that was constructed between 1951 and 53. Given Greenland's location between the US and Russia, the Thule Air Base remains one of the US's most important military installations for early warning. It's used for missile warning systems, space surveillance, and Arctic defense. Even if the US doesn't formally control Greenland, the US and Danish agreement when it comes to Greenland is that US can operate with little to no control and supervision, sometimes even against Danish and international law. During the Cold War, Denmark did not permit nuclear weapons on its soil in order not to intimidate the Soviet Union. This was the Danish policy. However, the Danish government had secretly accepted American nuclear bombs in Greenland. This became apparent to the public when, in 1968, a US B-52 bomber carrying nuclear arms crashed near the Thule airbase. Following the crash, the local and Danish personnel assisting the cleanup reported health issues related to radioactive exposure. This was recognized by the Danish government as late as in 1995, and small compensations were paid out. In another example of Denmark turning the blind eye to US actions in Greenland was the CIA's covert transfers of terrorists for interrogations following the 9/11 attacks. Following leaks by WikiLeaks, Danish investigations into the flights have been criticized by Amnesty International for not being thorough enough. Danish security rely on NATO and on the US as its closest ally. And Denmark really don't want to mess up this relationship, especially given the size of Denmark and the fact that Denmark can barely defend itself should it come to that. So, as you can hear, US interest in Greenland is nothing new. Also, as the ice melts, new shipping lanes are opening, cutting travel time between major economic hubs in the world. Greenland is positioned to control these routes, making it key to future global trade. Russia has been expanding its military presence in the region, building bases and icebreaker ships. China is investing heavily in Arctic projects, including mining and infrastructure. By acquiring Greenland, the US could solidify its influence in the Arctic and counterbalance Russia and China, while not having to go through Denmark each time. Greenland is also rich in natural resources. Its rare earth minerals are vital for modern technologies like smartphones, wind turbines, and military equipment. China currently dominates the global supply of these minerals, giving it significant leverage. Greenland's reserves could provide an alternative to China's almost monopoly. The island also has oil, gas, and vast freshwater reserves locked in its ice sheets. As climate change melts the Arctic, these resources are becoming more accessible, increasing Greenland's strategic and economic value. In this context, Trump's reiterated wish to buy Greenland is not so strange. It's more his straightforward and undiplomatic way of saying it that troubles policymakers in Greenland and Denmark. It's clearly in the US interest to control Greenland, and it has been for about 100 years or so. But is it also in Greenland and Denmark's interest to have Trump or the US take control of Greenland? Denmark will lose Greenland as a bargaining chip towards the US. There's a long historical and cultural bond between Denmark and Greenland, but the Danish engagement and benefit from Greenland have been somewhat limited to foreign policy and security, especially during the last 60 or 70 years. Greenland is the largest island in the world. It spans an area of 2 million square kilometers, larger than any US state and larger than Germany, Italy, United Kingdom, France and Spain combined. Without Greenland, Denmark is a very small country that US would have no real stake in. However, the Danish security situation is also changing as the Baltic states, Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, becoming the first line of defense towards Russia. Moreover, the security collaboration in Europe has also strengthened after Russia's invasion in Ukraine. Denmark will, for the next 100 years or so, want the US as its closest ally, no doubt about that, and it will be a foreign policy disaster for Denmark if the US should lose interest in Denmark. But Denmark's stake in Greenland per se is more or less limited to that, in my opinion. For Greenland, on the other hand, there's a lot at stake. Would Greenland want to be bought or recolonized by a foreign power like the US? Probably not. Greenland is likely to use US interests to increase Danish investments and secure more independence from Denmark. But I don't think that Greenland's interest is to join the US as a cold Puerto Rico. Greenland is really faced with the realities on the ground. First of all, the population is small, only consisting of 56,000 people. Second, more than half of the Greenlandic budget is made up of a yearly Danish economic grant of around 500 million USD. Given the small population and low diversification of the economy, it's hard to see how Greenland can become self-reliant. Adding to this a harsh climate and the need to import many basic goods, and also significant social problems make it hard to see Greenland's road to complete autonomy from any larger country. The best Greenland can hope for is probably the exploitation of its resources. But most colonial history in Africa and elsewhere has taught us mostly that opening up to various foreign powers and large mining companies rarely benefit more than just the local elite, bringing about corruption and exploitation of the locals at large. The US, with its history of mass genocide of the indigenous American people, has its own baggage and no special relationship with the Greenlandic people. So given these basic facts and the 1,000-year history with Denmark, it's my opinion that Greenland's future is not as completely independent country nor as a US colony. But it's up to the Greenlandic people to determine and chart their own course. Let me know your view on this matter in the comments below. Until next time, take care.